the old hardware. Nobody seems to know that. So Bob Westervelt. Thanks for good. Work with Tim.
Yeah, I think we had a meeting once a few years ago about some.
Good.
Some
your postdoc?
Last year grad school.
So you were, and then you rotated to postdoc.
I'm still a graduate student.
Well, you're still good.
Yeah.
This is super hot field, so you're cruising.
Hopefully, yeah. I can find someone who's willing to buy into the hype.
No. It's, I mean, they're really superconductors.
Yeah.
And they slide around when you don't touch them.
Yeah.
Entertaining.
Yeah. So I worked on it before the MIT stuff came out, so I was kind of lucky ahead of the curve. But now there's so many people doing it; it's very hard.
Yeah, I was in Hong Kong for this Gordon conference.
Yeah.
Well, it was one of the stuff where the people are sort of like halfway there. You know, they give these pretty bad talks.
Yeah.
About being deep in the mud and this and the other, but that was like the main thing. So.
Yeah. I've seen a few of those myself at March meetings. Yeah.
So this thing is streamed over YouTube, which is wonderful. It actually works. And you will become a celebrity afterwards because they actually won't see you, but they can hear you talk. The thing is, if there's something that you don't want to project to the universe, you can take it out of the but it's all,
Yeah,
so
it's all fine.
competitors.
I'm mostly going over published stuff that's.
Okay. I just, you know. Okay, well, let's get started. Today we have one of our own, Stephen Carr, who's working with Jim Katzir's group as a graduate student. He's working on what is actually a super hot topic, in part because there was an enormous discovery that if you have two layers of twisted graphene at some magic angle, and I think you'll explain what's magic, of 1.1 degrees, that it superconducts. And not only does it superconducts at a very high temperature compared with the Fermi energy, and it looks like a high PC superconductor. Except that it's not. It's not made of the same stuff, it's just carbon. And so this discovery has sort of, what's the right word, made the whole field sort of wake up and make attention. It turns out with Twistronic, which is putting layers, a robot puts layer 1 on top of layer 2, and you can put it at any angle you want. That's not possible with MPE, for example. That you can make a whole layer of variety of heterostructures that have different quantum mechanical properties that have never been seen before. This is what we all want to work on, and so on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, let's see. Is the microphone working?
Yeah.
Okay. Hard to tell from up here. Yeah. Okay, so thank you. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about some of the modeling that I've been involved with relation to these multi-layer twisted 2D materials. So I'm going to begin with a short introduction and then give an outline about the different materials we're going to look at. So this was a picture on the left here was from a pretty popular review article back kind of at the beginning of the multi-layer 2D material history. What they're showing here is the idea that you can take different materials. It's a little small, but there's like graphene, HBN, some of the TMDCs, and you can put them on top of each other, kind of like Lego blocks. And this is a kind of cool idea because graphene has some nice transport properties, but it doesn't have any spin-orbit coupling. And some of these other materials have magnetism, spin-orbit coupling, topological states, and a band gap. And so the idea might be, by putting graphene near it, you can inherit those properties in a very high mobility material. Unfortunately, this is very idealized, and the actual case, as many experimentalists found out, looks more like this. So when you actually have a 2D material on top of another 2D material, especially even if they're the same material, they don't line up nicely. And even when they are the same material, when they're different materials and the lattices are different, you can't guarantee that they're going to click together like Lego blocks. So at first, it seems like a really big problem, right? Because you have these basically sheets of tissue paper stacked on top of each other, and you're trying to understand the physics and get some robust phenomenon out of it. However, this problem of the stacking and this problem of misalignment and disorder actually gives you a whole new tool to analyze these materials. And that is the Moiré pattern. So when you take two layers of graphene and you manually put them on top of each other, this is done using a number of very specialized techniques, some in the clean room, some on a lab bench, you can control the relative orientation between the layers. And so if you look closely here, you'll notice there are these kind of whitish areas. That's when the hexagons are aligned. And there are these darker areas. That's when the hexagons are not aligned. They're sort of in an AB or Bernal stacked graphene mode. And if you change the relative orientation between the layers, you can very clearly see different sorts of patterns emerge. And the main thing here is that they have different length scales. So on the right side, we have an example of a logarithmic scale. We have the twist angle shown in degrees, and the characteristic length of the Moiré pattern in nanometers on the left. And so you can see that when the layers are aligned, you have conventional condensed matter. You have 3 angstrom periodicity. But as you make this twist angle very, very small, you can get huge length scales, hundreds of nanometers. So this new platform of physics gives you a lot of new tools to study correlations, to study topological edge states, 1D modes. And we're going to have to build some intuition for how to model this and understand this. OK, so this is the experiment that Professor Westervelt was talking about. This came out last year from Pablo Herrera's group at MIT. And what they see is that if you go kind of into this low-energy band structure of twisted bilayer graphene, you see this very flat band. So this is K as a function of energy. So this bandwidth doesn't look like conventional graphene. It doesn't have these really steep dispersion from the Dirac cones. And because of that, the correlations become very important. So you can see that here. This is sort of in the middle of this band structure. There's this correlated insulating state, a mod insulator, and on both sides you have these superconducting domes. And so this is very exciting. Now you'll notice the temperature is very low, it's about 300 millikelvin. But the presence of superconductivity next to a correlated insulating state, as well as the relative size of this temperature versus the Fermi energy and the Fermi velocity, lets us know that this is really acting likely it's likely to be an unconventional superconductor, something that's dominated by electron-electron correlations and not phonon-mediated couplings. Now, the details of this are still not sure. People are studying both avenues theoretically and experimentally, so we're not sure if it is actually a strongly correlated superconductor, but it seems very, very likely because of this phase diagram. But twisted bilayer graphene is not the only situation where this happens. You can find correlations, both mod insulators as well as superconductivity, in a wide variety of graphitic structures. So there's a number of experimental groups that have looked at graphene under pressure, tri-layer graphene on top of hexagonal boron nitride, and twisted bilayers of Bernal stacked graphene. So this is 2 layers of bilayer graphene with a twist angle. And all of these show mod insulating correlations, similar but slightly different than those seen in their partner devices. So if we just look at graphitic devices, there's already a large array of structures you can look at. But there are other types of materials too. So here's graphene in brown. But there's HBN, there's the TMDCs. You have kind of more exotic compounds that are less well studied, like black phosphorus. Still very important, just doesn't have the nice honeycomb network, has a rectangular structure. And then also there's magnetic materials like chromium triiodide. And so the game right now is taking these materials and putting them on top of each other and trying to understand how you can get new metamaterials that have properties greater than the sum of the whole. Okay. And by doing this, you're able to see a lot of different types of properties. So you have twist-controlled optical properties, like optical response. You can make localized excitons. You can find 1D network modes. And you can make quasicrystals. So I'm going to go over some of these in my talk and talk about how we're modeling these. So here's the outline. The first section, which will take up most of the time, is an overview of the multiscale methods for understanding these twisted 2D materials. Then we're going to go through a few examples and talk about some fun ways we can tune these even more, not just using the length scale, but also using some other parameters of the system. OK. So twisted bilayers are pretty hard to model. Here's the reason why. If you see this characteristic length scale between these in this Moiré pattern, if you make a supercell out of this thing, it's going to have thousands of atoms. This is a hexagonal network of bilayer graphene. So because you have so many atoms, it's very hard to model it using conventional techniques. So things like DFT or type binding are very expensive. These large variations in the angle or the length scale means that you need to have a model that can handle very small length scales and very long length scales at the same time. And finally, only for specific twisting angles can you actually make these structures periodic on this long length scale. In general, they're not periodic, and more importantly, in experiment, there's likely variation in this Moiré pattern. So being able to handle all of these different problems is going to be really important. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we take advantage of this sort of divide and conquer technique. What you can do is look at a Moiré pattern of a twisted bilayer. This is a triangular lattice. Red is one layer, blue is the other layer. And here's the Moiré pattern between the identical stacking spots. If I zoom in on these little local regions in these colors, I can then look at the local stacking arrangement between the layers. Now, if the twist angle is pretty small, this kind of looks like an unrotated layer. You kind of have a blue layer on top of the red layer. You can kind of ignore the twisting angle, and it looks like maybe a periodic system. And so this was some effort that we put in with some mathematical collaborators. There's a one-to-one correspondence between any incommensurate Moiré system and this sort of configuration space of where the blue atom can be with respect to the red atom in the unit cell of the red atom. So you can then apply this modeling technique to a number of different properties. So conceptually what we're doing is replacing our Hamiltonian that depends on space, replacing it with a Hamiltonian that depends on the configuration, which also depends on space. But then we suppress this R as we do the modeling. So for mechanical relaxations, you can look at the local energy stacking. Local energy is a function of the interlayer stacking. So that's called a generalized stacking fault energy, or GSFEE. And so that's pretty easy to pull out of DFT. For electronic models, it's a little bit harder. We go through the route of using a type binding approximation. And I'm going to talk about that in a few slides, how we get that. Let's focus on the mechanics for now. So this is some DFT data from doing graphene and MOS2, a representative of the transition metal dichalcogenides, as a function of the stacking between the layers. So this little color map here is basically the unit cell of the bottom layer. And the different points in that unit cell are where the second layer is with respect to the lower cell. So you'll notice that this energy scale goes from about 0 to 20 MeV. And these red spots are the high energy AA stacked graphene, and the black areas are the Bernal stacked graphene, and they're degenerate in terms of energy. For the TMDC, it's a little bit different. You have, again, high energy stackings, but then you have two different low energy stacking nodes. So you can look at this along a line cut along the diagonal, so kind of like that. Can't do it with the laser pointer. And what you find is that graphene has this kind of nice smooth potential. It's symmetric around this ABBA point. There's a saddle point in the middle, and there's a high energy AA. And the same thing for the TMDCs, just with different energy scale. So what we do is we combine this information with information about the local straining energy, so the compression and expansion of the material, how that contributes to total energy. And we can make a parallel plate model just using normal continuum theory. So this is the results we get. What you're seeing here are basically red and blue dots that correspond to the bottom or the top layer. And although you can't really see the individual atoms very well, you can see the Moiré pattern, and you can see the emerging reconstruction due to the relaxations. So for graphene, these two different low energy stackings, they want to take up most of the material after you allow for relaxations. The high energy stackings, which are at the center of our model, you can see that there's this sort of white area. That's the AA honeycomb aligned stacking. That's a very small amount of area compared to now these large areas of Bernal stack graphene. Similarly, for the TMDC, when it's rotated by 180 degrees, you have two different intermediate stackings. One of them is more favorable than the other. And so instead of having 6 copies of identical ground states, you have 3 copies of an identical ground state. That's due to the threefold rotation of these hexagonal crystals. And now we see that, again, the high energy stacking has been confined. You have these domain wall type modes, and you have these large domains of either hexagonal or triangular shapes. What's more is we can look at this as a function of the twist angle. So on the right, I'm showing the interlayer stacking energy as a function of the twist angle. So this is going from 2 degrees down to 0.05 degrees. And so the white areas are the saddle points, the walls. The red areas are the AA stacking, and the black areas are the low energy Bernal stacking. And so this is in a zoomed out mode where we keep the length scale, the Moiré lattice the same, and this is zoomed in at the AA spot. And so we're seeing that once you get below about 1 degree, this AA spot, its local geometry does not change with the twisting angle. This is sort of an emergent property of all these 2D materials. When you go to very small twist angles, there's going to be a locked-in high energy defect due to the twisting angle, and then the twisting angle just changes the length scale of these walls. So that's going to be really important later for electronic structure, but for now we're just going to move on.
So,
sure.
What I think it's a dumb question. So that these things flex so that they're actually matched up in between, and then looks like a grain boundary.
Exactly.
So that it's really perfectly aligned in between.
Yeah, so if we look here, you can see here, this is a very uniform area. If I just cut this picture out, it would look like a perfect crystal. You wouldn't be able to tell that the layers are twisted. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, so now let's go into the electronic modeling. This is going to make up the foundation of most of the results that I show for the rest of the talk. So I just want to quickly explain where we get these type binding models from. We're not using any fitting. What we're using is basically a Fourier transform from DFT calculations. So density functional theory is very good at getting accurate first principles calculations of electronic structure for a wide variety of materials. And what you can do is take the plane wave solutions, and you can do a Fourier transform on them with some additional phase fixing. And you can basically transform these plane wave band structures into localized type binding orbitals. I'm not going to go into the details of this because it's fairly technical, but the point is that for graphene and the TMDCs, we know how to do this, and it's very reliable. And if you do this for 2 layers, you can actually look at the coupling between, say, the dyz orbital and the dz squared orbital, maybe. And you can change the orientation between the layers. You can see how the coupling depends on space. And this gives us a very accurate reproduction of the band structure. And we've done this for a number of configurations, a number of materials, under strain and under pressure previously.
When you say localized about what?
About the atom. Well, they're localized in space. So these here are...
wave packet. You just let it be.
Yeah, so originally this wave packet is a block state, so it's delocalized. What you then have to do is pick a center to project it onto, and it'll make this localized orbital. And because of the periodicity of the block wave, you can pick the orbital to be centered on any site, and it'll be identical, just translated. Yeah. Yeah. And so I'll have some pictures later showing some comparisons of a block wave and a Vannier. This is called a Vannier function. I'll have a comparison between the block wave band structures and the Vannier band structures in a different situation, and you'll find that they match up exactly, which is quite nice. It also gives us a lot of insight, because these are like chemical bonding orbitals, very similar to those of hydrogen. Okay, so just to take a step back, what I've explained so far are the first 3 boxes on the left of this flowchart of our multiscale approach. We use DFT to build type binding models or continuum elasticity models for either the electrons or the atoms, respectively. The next section of the talk is going to be looking at graphene and looking at how we can use these to understand electronic structure. I'm also going to talk a little bit about building really reduced models of these low energy states so that you can apply many body theory like Hartree-Fock. Okay, and just to give a sense of why doing this multiscale modeling is important, it allows you to do high throughput modeling. What that means is that instead of having to look at a single twisted bilayer of a certain type of material on another certain type of material, we can actually automate this whole sequence from a programmatic point of view. So George Strasarius, postdoc in Professor Kaxiris' group, has been leading this, and it's working quite well, and we have some nice results to show that the idea works. These are different configurations of multi-layer graphene. We have a way of representing this in a tree format, which the computer really likes, and we're able to get band structure out, which, this is the flat band of magic angle graphene, and these are a little bit more complicated. I'll get to some of them later. Okay, so bilayer graphene. So I'm going to quickly introduce bilayer graphene's low energy electronic structure for those who aren't familiar. Monolayer graphene has what's called a Dirac cone at low energy. So these are linearly dispersive energy relationships. When you have 2 layers of graphene in the band structure, because of the twist angle, you're able to separate them in space. So this is sort of like saying that I have a cone from one layer, a cone from another layer. Because of the twist angle, they've sort of moved apart from each other in momentum space. And so the way you can understand these flat bands that appear is you look at the relative energy separation between the overlap of these 2 cones, and then you look at the relative interlayer coupling between the layers. Now here I have in black dashed lines the monolayer cones. And what we notice is that because of the interlayer coupling, these intersections become hybridized and they make an avoided band crossing. So we're able to see a nice little parabolic band gap open there. The idea then is to tune the twisting angle, which controls the spacing between the cones, such that the energy between the crossing points is equivalent to 2 times the hybridization energy. You can see this over here. This is a 1.5 degrees, so a little bit above the magic angle. You kind of have a Dirac cone going like this, a Dirac cone going like that, a Dirac cone going like this, Dirac cone going like that. And because of the hybridization, gaps are opening up. And if you tune it just right, you can make these gaps and these gaps cancel each other out and make a nice flat band right there. So how do we do this accurately? So the explanation I just gave is very heuristic. It's very qualitative. Maybe we could do full DFT. Some people have, but it's very expensive. You need a supercomputer and lots of time and a grant to do that, because you need about 10,000 atoms to do the magic angle. I don't really want to do this because it's the kind of thing where you start the project and it takes 2 months to know if you have a bug in your code or not. So it's not really the kind of work that I like to do. You can also use type binding models. We have done this, and this is quite successful, but it still has some issues. One is that you can only stay above this small angle of 0.5, which seems pretty small, but we actually do want to go below that as well. The issue is that if you go below this twisting angle, even for type binding models, solving the problem becomes just computationally too expensive. You have matrices of size 100,000 by 100,000, and then this diagonalizing these is not very pretty. So the other problem with type binding techniques in DFT is that you're restricted to commensurate angles. And to get some intuition for these systems, it'd be really nice to smoothly change the twist angle and not have to rely on these commensurate or periodic systems, which don't smoothly vary with the twisting angle. Okay, so the way we solve these problems is we use a continuum model. This is pretty well justified in the literature. It's been done since 2007. Recently, we've kind of expanded these continuum models to be more accurate to account for crystal relaxations. And I'm just going to quickly overview the idea, but not go into any of the details. You have the two cones. Each cone can be written down in momentum space in terms of the Dirac equation. And the interlayer coupling can be written in terms of a Fourier decomposition of the real space interlayer coupling between the layers. So what naturally happens is you get this scattering process where the monolayer graphene, which has a very large Brillouin zone reciprocal lattice, it inherits the momentum scattering of the Moiré supercell. So the Moiré supercell is very big in space. So in momentum space, it has a very small Brillouin zone. And that means you're going to scatter around these Dirac cones because of the interlayer coupling and make a network of collected block states, connected block states. That's what you see over here. So the blue lines correspond to couplings between the same layer, so white circles to white circles. And then the black circles are the other layer. So for example, the red couplings, which are interlayer, you'll notice they go from black circles to open circles. So this is fairly involved. I don't have time to explain the model in detail, but that's the general idea. So what are we going to see? Well, here's an example of vertical corrugation in the top layer of twisted bilayer graphene at 0.9 degrees. Again, matching on to what we saw earlier with the relaxations, you see that these areas that are red are very high, so it means that the layers are very far separated, about 3.6 angstroms. And then the dark blue areas are Bernal stacked AV graphene, so they're about 3.3 angstroms. So you're seeing this vertical variation in space, and you're also seeing these sort of nice one-dimensional domain walls show up. And you can see that in the actual positions of the atoms as well. This is using an exaggerated coupling so that you can see it more clearly. You can see AA spots, you can see these lines, and you get these perfect triangles of Bernal stack graphene. This is really important because the flat bands have a local density of state that looks like this. So if you take the flat bands and you do a Fourier transform on them just directly, you can get the real space density of states of them. And the real space density of states of the flat bands shows a lot of electronic density right on these AA spots. So we know that the electronic wave functions that have a role in the correlated effects, they're mostly at these AA spots, and so capturing those AA spots accurately is really important. And on top of that, we know these AA spots kind of have a fixed size as a function of the twist angle. So because the relaxations are causing very uniform stacking orientations and very uniform stacking structures, it's likely that these relaxations are confining the electronic wave function in a way that you wouldn't capture if, you wouldn't capture if you ignored mechanical relaxations.
Is that, it looks like they aren't coupled at all. I mean, the wave functions, the overlap is like near zero. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so if this was like if this was like an optical lattice problem, you'd say they just have very weak coupling between them. But you have to remember that this is coming from a lattice of coupled graphene. This length scale here is like 400 angstroms. Yeah. So there's just tons of graphene in between them. Depending on how you try to write down this reduced model, if you try to have only these states, the only way you can do that is by actually creating a triangular, like a single state won't be this spot. It'll actually be something that corresponds to all three of these. There's no way you can make just a 2-band or a 1-band model that has just spots here. I'll try to explain. This comes up later in the talk. But I'll come back to that question. That's a really good question. So armed with this tool, we can look at the band structure as a function of the twist angle. So this is just a fun little animation. So I want to draw your attention to this band gap size here, this band gap size here. These are the two low energy bands that eventually show correlations at the magic angle. And pay attention to how they hybridize through each other as the angle goes through the magic angle. Yeah, so this is one of the advantages of using this continuum model. You're able to see very smoothly what's going on with the band hybridization. And it looks kind of like a topological band inversion. The bands are passing through each other. So in this slide, I've tried to extract a lot of that information from the video and put it into a plot. It's kind of busy, so I'll try to explain it very quickly. We have two rows. The top row is for an unrelaxed graphene system, and the bottom row is for the relaxed graphene system. On the right, we have an example of the band structure. So the top one is the unrelaxed magic angle, and the bottom is the relaxed magic angle. We can see a nice flat band in both cases, and there's also gaps between the flat bands and the neighboring bands at gamma. I also, in blue, label the band width. That's basically how much this band disperses across the entire Brillouin zone. And then in black, although it's not plotted, we have Fermi velocity, which is basically the curvature or the slope of this band at the K-point. So that corresponds to the three colors you see in these plots. The top half of the plot is the electron side, so over here, and the bottom half is the hole side, so down here. And the red, blue, and black correspond to bandwidth, band gap, and Fermi velocity. So what we'll notice is that the Fermi velocity gets very small, which is reminiscent of a flat band. The bandwidth gets very small, and the band gap gets very large. And so this happens all at the same time, and this is a signature of the magic angle regime. You have very large single particle band gaps due to the Moiré interlayer coupling, and you have very small bandwidths. The other thing to notice is that this is not true for a single angle, but rather there's a large range of angles where these bands are very flat. So this is really good news from an experimental side because it means you don't have to tune it to exactly the magic angle. You can have a little bit of variation. You can have plus or minus 0.05 degrees, and it'll still work really well. OK, so on this slide, I'm just going to quickly explain how we know that this relaxation modeling is working really well for real systems. So this is some data from Philip Kim's group. Hyobin and Rebecca in Philip's group did this. Hyobin's in the audience today. This up here is the filling factor. So n over n0 is how many electrons you have in the Moiré supercell. 0 corresponds to the Fermi energy, and this is the conductivity, G, conductance. Not sure which one. As you go to the right or the left, you're putting electrons into the system or taking them out. What you can see is that in even fillings of 4 or 8 electrons, you see these dips in the resistance. If we use the unrelaxed model and then plot the total density of states, we get this hot mess. So on the bottom, we have again, the filling, n over n0, same axis. And we have here the density of states for the entire system. The 3 different colors correspond to 3 different twisting angles. And as you change the twisting angle, you just get a huge variation in the density of states. If you have the relaxed system, which is down here, the variation is much smaller, and you can see very clear dips in the resistance at 4, 8, minus 4, 8, also at 0, which is the Dirac cone. And this is validated by band structure calculations. Basically, reconstruction of the lattice stabilizes the band structure and protects the formation of these mini Dirac cones. So this minus 4 and plus 4 filling are this feature and this feature, and then the minus 8 and plus 8 are basically these features here. Without this atomic reconstruction, you don't really get this, and so it's really important to include these corrections if you want to understand experiment. OK, so the last thing I'm going to talk about with this continuum model is the suppression of magic angles. So this is a plot of the Fermi velocity, Vf over V0, as a function of the twist angle. So what we're seeing here is that at around 1 degree, the Fermi velocity vanishes. That's the first magic angle. In the original continuum model that most people use to understand the twisted bilayer graphene, you see that this Fermi velocity continues to vanish in fractions of the magic angle. So this is basically theta over 2, theta over 3, theta over 4. In our unrelaxed model, it kind of does the same thing, although it's a little bit confusing here, likely because of some further corrections to the model. But you still see a very clear vanishing of the Fermi velocity here. And these correspond to higher order magic angles. When you include relaxations, these higher order magic angles completely disappear. And the way you can understand this is by looking at the atomic relaxation. So the magic angle, it's not just a flat band. It actually has a real space interpretation. You have these real space structures that tell you the interlayer coupling between them. So AB is low coupling, AA is high coupling. So these electrons that are sitting in the Dirac cone of each layer, they're seeing a potential well. And this potential well varies in space. And so without relaxations, you can change the twisting angle, and the potential well gets more and more shallow because the length scale of this potential well gets more and more large. And so naturally, like with a harmonic oscillator, as you make the potential well very, very shallow, you can put lots of states in it. And so these are basically higher order, these are like the first level, the second level, the third level of some sort of harmonic potential well. With relaxations, the well keeps the same shape, especially at small angles. And so as you change the twisting angle, you're not able to reproduce these features, and you basically have a very uniform electronic structure at low energies. OK, so now I'm going to go back to the question that Professor Westerveld asked about the type binding model of the flat bands. Are these bands localized? So if you carefully analyze the symmetry of the low energy states, these are symmetry eigenvalues of the eigenvectors at different high symmetry points. So for example, here we're at the gamma point. If you do the mirror symmetry, which basically is a swapping between the left and the right sides of your geometry, you find that the eigenvectors have either a positive or a negative value. There's other symmetries related to the threefold rotation. If you carefully write all these down and try to write down a two-band type binding model that captures all of these symmetries, you'll find that it's impossible. There's no real space model that captures all of this. The only way you can make a two-band model that captures all of this and gets just the flat bands is if you break one of these symmetries. And so people have done this over the last few years, and what they get are these kind of really extended Wannier orbitals, these very extended type binding orbitals. They don't look like single AA spots. They look like a fidget spinner of 3 different AA spots. Yeah. And because of that, they have very strange non-local Hubbard hopping terms. Yeah, because I don't have slides of this because there are a few other scientists that have looked into this, but it's really quite funky. And just look up fidget spinner, bilayer graphene. Yeah, that's what people call it.
I'm trying to come up with some simple models.
Sure.
But in order to get them, you mean they have to be interacting, and so the low-level modes is not just fooling, but if you had 3 of them, they're tightly coupled, and when you ping it with a hammer,
yeah.
low-energy modes have the whole all 3.
Yeah, all 3 of them. Yeah, all 3. It has to do with the complicated band structure inversion that's going on in these systems. These don't really have a nice representation as an isolated band. It doesn't have Chern number. It's not topologically protected, but it's called a fragile topology in that you have these topologically trivial bands that don't have a real space analog. There's no way of enforcing these symmetries.
But that means that I'm trying to make a single particle model.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're saying that's not so easy because you ping it, it's another quasi-particle that you're not talking about yet.
Yeah. The quasi-particle is really delocalized in space over these different spots, and so it doesn't act like a normal Hubbard lattice model. It acts very strange. Yeah. We're going to actually make ours act like a Hubbard model by doing a trick. You can make these bands you can make a type binding model if you include additional bands. You can make a realistic type binding model. So instead of doing just the flat bands, we're going to do these 2 flat bands, plus some of the bands above and plus some of the bands below. So here's an 8-band model in purple, and then 2 different 5-band models in red and blue. And so in all 3 cases, we get perfect reproduction of the low energy modes. We get perfect reproduction of the modes just above and below the flat bands. And we can do this for a wide variety of twist angles. So it's a really nice platform for doing correlation studies. These are what the Wannier functions look like. So these white lines are the Moiré lattice. So these triangles are basically tracing out the AA spot couplings. You'll notice that the ones that are centered at the AA spot look like nice localized orbitals. The ones centered at the AB or BA Bernal stack spots also look like nice localized triangles. And then the 3 domain wall or Kagome lattice structures, they look like these nicely localized circles. So if you include additional bands, you can make a nice looking, tightly bound Wannier basis where the Hubbard terms are going to act in a conventional way. But you can't do this unless you include these additional states. And so now the model is more complicated. And now the effective coupling between, say, something on this site and then something on this site, on neighboring AA sites, it's dominated by couplings that go through either these Bernal stacked objects or through these domain wall purple objects here. So it's really a complicated lattice model. We can look at the projected density of states. You see that most of the flat bands are orange, which are the AA orbitals. But at the gamma point, there are little bits that are green and purple, which are these other geometric objects. And so this is showing the sort of the fragile topology of the system. There's no way of ever doing just these 2 bands with just AA spotted centered orbitals. You have to include some additional symmetry information to get it. Okay, and then this is a projected density of states at low energy. It's just showing that almost all the density of states for the flat bands is in orange. The scale here is 10 times smaller, so we're just looking in there. Okay. And this is just showing off that the model works for a large number of twisting angles. So in our model, the magic angle is around 1 degree. It's not 1.1. This is just details of how you pull out the interlayer coupling numbers. And then as you look to the left and the right, we see we're able to reproduce the twisting angle band structures really accurately. This little inset is showing the twist dependence of the spread of the Wannier functions. So those pictures from before, they have some sort of average radius, some spread. And what we see is that the orbitals centered at AA, they scale basically linearly or almost linearly with the twisting angle, whereas the other two orbitals scale like the Moiré length scale, 1 over theta. So this is good. It means that near the magic angle where our model is kind of built for, we get localized AA modes that don't depend on the twisting angle, which is the argument we made earlier based on the relaxations. OK. So that's it for twisted bilayer graphene. You can all read the sigh of relief. The next few systems are a little bit more simple. They're easier to understand, and hopefully can give you more intuition for these sort of Moiré flat band phenomena. So I'm going to look at some electrons on the band edges of the transition metal dichalcogenides. This is, I think, I didn't write down. I think this is a bilayer MOS2, but I could be wrong, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that there was a nice PRL paper last year where they did a full DFT calculation of this large twisted TMDC bilayer. And what they found is that you can get bands on the conduction band, valence band edge and the conduction band edge that start to look flat. The valence band ones look really flat, and they actually plot the bandwidth as a function of the twisting angle. So here we're going towards 0 degrees and towards 60 degrees. 60 degrees is the other aligned phase of TMDC, so it's sort of like two different types of materials, both going towards 0 degrees. But you can see the bandwidth of this band edge is getting very small. This one's almost 0, this one's about 20 MeV. And if you look at the real space charge density, you see these nice red dots, very reminiscent of the twisted bilayer graphene sites. So I think it's bilayer MOS2, but I didn't write it down, and I can't remember off the top of my head. It turns out it doesn't really matter what the material is. All the TMDCs do this. Yeah. So sorry about that. So we're going to do the same thing, but with type binding, because the DFT calculations take forever. So here's a picture of MOS2. We see that there's metal atoms in the middle. This is the 3D view. This is a top-down view. And then there's these yellow atoms, which are chalcogenides. Those are the S's. So from the top, it looks like graphene. But what's actually happening is you have metal atoms in the middle and then these dimers of chalcogenides. And unfortunately for us, the band edges, which is where we're going to be able to see the flat bands for a number of reasons, one of them being that's where the transport experiment can access, because it's near the band gap, near the Fermi energy, is that this color here, this green color, corresponds to a d orbital, while the blue corresponds to p orbitals, or chalcogenides. So these green bands correspond to the metal states, and the purple bands correspond to the states on the yellow orbitals, the yellow atoms. Now, normally for the TMDCs, you just want to use a simple two-center approximation, but you can't really. You can do that for the yellow atoms because they're near the edge of the material. You can't really do that for the metal atoms in the middle. So these chalcogenides you can use using like Slater-Coaster or something, but the metal atoms you can't do that. You need a much more accurate model because they see the atomic environment of all the sulfur atoms around them. So to kind of showcase this, we use our Wannier technique to look at the electronic couplings in our DFT calculations. This is couplings between the metal atoms of the top layer and the top layer of chalcogenide atoms of the bottom layer. So this is what I'm doing. I'm looking at this orange or red thing to these yellow things. And these are the different decompositions of the angular momentum. These are the different decompositions of angular momentum for the chalcogenides. And you can see that these structures have some very non-trivial symmetries and rotational variations, which means you can't model this accurately just using some sort of two-center or distance-dependent functional. And if you get these wrong, you don't get the band edge physics right, so you won't see the flat bands. OK, so using that, we then do a type binding calculation. So we see flat bands. OK, not very exciting. They just look like lines. These are some preliminary results. This is tungsten diselenide bilayer. This is niobium disulfide bilayer. So like I said, it doesn't really matter what material you use. This always happens. These are going from large angles to small angles, so about 4 degrees to about 2.5 degrees. And what we notice is that the band is getting a little bit flatter. Here it's hard to tell, but here you can see the band has a little bit of dispersion. As you go to small angles, it gets very flat. What's more interesting is that the second set of bands here, you see this thing that kind of looks like a bat. It gets really flat as you go, again, to small angles. And so what we're seeing is the emergence of not just one flat band, but multiple flat bands. And also, it's very suspicious because there's one band here and then 2 bands here. And so that also is a pattern that some people who just took quantum mechanics might remember. OK, it's the 2D quantum harmonic oscillator. So the idea here is very simple. We look at the band edge of our monolayer. It looks like a effective mass. It looks like some sort of parabolic potential. So this is basically a free electron with a dress mass. And then the interlayer coupling is a function of space. It's periodic, and it looks like a sinusoidal object. I don't have a picture of this because it's kind of hard to extract directly from the DFT, so I just kind of drew a little cartoon. But the takeaway is that over this Moiré pattern, you have this oscillating 2D sinusoidal potential. And so at the bottom of this potential, you're going to have a Hamiltonian that looks like our harmonic oscillator, because you have a band edge that's described by mk squared, and an interlayer coupling or potential that's described by omega squared r squared. So just to remind everyone what the harmonic oscillator does, it's a well, and the things in it like to form standing waves of different momenta. So you have an S wave, a P wave. Okay, these are like higher order, and they don't correspond to electronic orbitals, but at least the first two, you can kind of call them an S and a P wave. It kind of makes sense. And in 2D, the levels of this, they don't go 0, they don't go 1/2, 3/2, 5/2. They go 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's because you have two different quantum numbers, one for x and one for y. And so the first level is when these two are both 0, so there's one of them. And the second level is when one of these is 1, so there's two of them, and et cetera. So basically every level, if you're on the 5th level of the 2D harmonic oscillator, it has 5 solutions for different choices of these two numbers. So now let's see if that's true. I'm going to keep track of the band average of all my bands in my type binding calculation, and the band widths, so that's the total amount of dispersion across the entire Brillouin zone, as a function of the twisting angle, going from large twisting angles to very small twisting angles. And this is what I see. So I've kind of arranged the data in a very suggestive way here. The circles are telling me the band average energy in terms of MEV below the monolayer band edge. So just think of it like if I turned off the interlayer coupling, if I made this a monolayer system, all these band edges would be right up there. As I change the twisting angle from, say, 10 degrees to 6 degrees, I see that there's this band that's getting closer and closer to the monolayer band edge. And in color, I have the band width. So really dark red means the band is very, very flat. And so what we can see is that these bands are linearly approaching the starting point, and they're getting flatter and flatter as they go. And then you can also count how many there are. So this one, there's one set of bands. Here you can see there's two separate set of bands, these sort of circles that are on top of each other, and they're kind of coming coincident. And then here, if you look very carefully, there's actually 3 bands for every twisting angle. So what this tells us is that the flat bands in the TMDCs, or rather the flat bands in any semiconductor, can be understood with a simple harmonic oscillator model. Now there's variations on this, depending on if you have additional corrections in your model. I think a few groups have looked at how you can get Chern numbers in these Moiré flat bands. And it basically amounts to harmonic oscillator states with some additional skyrmionic texture. So this is really good because it means I don't have to do DFT calculations. Yay. Okay. So the last section is going to be on how we can further control these Moiré systems. So I'm going to quickly go through 3 examples here.
Has anybody done experiments to look for superconductivity or funny electronic states?
Yes, it is an ongoing matter, and I'm pretty sure there are quite a few people at MIT and Harvard doing these experiments on the TMDCs. Yeah. One of the issues is the TMDCs don't have nearly as good mobility as graphene. Yeah. So the quality of the devices is a lot lower, which makes seeing the superconductivity likely much harder. Hopefully the TC is a lot higher than 300 millikelvin though. Okay, so I'm going to go through 3 examples. The first one's pressure, the second one is what we call sandwiching layers, and the last one is going to be chemical intercalation of donor species, things that donate electrons. So this was a set of calculations we did last year. We looked at how the interlayer coupling between graphene layers depends on the vertical applied pressure. So these red-blue things here are the Wannier orbitals of the PZ graphene states. These are what make up the Dirac cone. And these green arrows are telling us that we're pushing them together. So this plot is showing how DFT compression between the layers corresponds to a realistic, experimentally controllable pressure. And this inset is showing us something called lambda n ratio. This is basically the enhancement of the interlayer coupling. The lambda n is an artifact of the parameterization we use, but just think of it as the ratio of the interlayer coupling. So if you compress the system by 20%, so if you make the layers 20% closer, you're going to triple the interlayer coupling. And like we said before, we're controlling some sort of Moiré potential. It looks like a harmonic well. This is making the well really, really deep, which is going to be useful for us. OK, so here are some examples of band structures that we calculated under different pressures. So this epsilon is basically the vertical compression between the layers. These are uncompressed. These are compressed by 5%, and these are compressed by 10%. What we find is that if you start at 1 degree, or 1.1 degree, the magic angle, you can then go to larger angles and again make flat bands. And you can then do a very careful numerical study, which is where this pretty picture comes from. We did a bunch of calculations of the band structure as a function of the twisting angle, the twisting angle down here, and as a function of the external pressure, which has a mapping onto the compression. So this is what I use, because this is what I can do in my calculation. This is what experimentalists look at. So I think for most experiments, 3 gigapascals is about the limit to what people can make for these 2D materials. But there are systems that go to really high pressure, but they use different techniques that aren't good for low temperature physics. So this little bright white spot is telling us that the band gap at gamma is very small. So that's the gap of these 2 band manifolds. So you'll notice this bright white basically corresponds to these flat bands. And also, if you look carefully, there's these additional white lines down here. Those are the higher order magic angles, but I'm not going to worry about those. This was confirmed in an experiment. Corey Dean's group at Columbia had some very nice experiments where they found that at 1.3 degrees roughly and at 2.2 gigapascals, you can see correlation effects. This is a transport study through the flat bands. And they see these dips in the resistance that correspond to correlated states. So these are the correlated mod insulators. And when you don't have this pressure, you don't really see them. It's kind of heavily suppressed. And our model predicts them at about 1.31, plus a little bit of noise, because we don't actually know what the magic angle in the model is. It depends on your parameterization of the it depends on how accurate your DFT calculations are, and we all know the DFT calculations are only accurate within like 10% anyway. So really good agreement. So we're really happy about that. So now I'm going to look at the graphene sandwich. The idea here is that instead of having just a bilayer of graphene, you add an additional layer on top. So here the red and the green layers are 2 layers of graphene with a twist angle. The blue layer is aligned with the red layer. So we call this a sandwich because you kind of have 2 layers of bread and then like a twisted layer of ham in between or something. This is the Moiré Brillion zone. So this is kind of the band structure. This is where we're sampling. So these colored lines are the Brillion zones of either the monolayer in the middle or the combined effective layer of these 2, because they have the same geometry. And then the Moiré supercell is this smaller hexagon over here. So down here I have some band structure calculations from our multiscale technique. If you look at the twisted bilayer at 1.1 degrees, you see very flat bands. If you look at the sandwich, you also see very flat bands, but you see also these kind of very dispersive bands going through. And if you look at a monolayer on a bilayer, so that's if I kind of like switch the order of these 2, the bands are kind of flat, but they're not nearly as nice. And that's because you have less symmetry in the system. So the 2 key things here in the sandwich is that you have a band that's about as flat as the Moiré flat band in twisted bilayer graphene, but the twisting angle is almost 50% bigger. And this is good for correlations because it means the correlated states are going to be closer together, which means stronger interaction between them. So we hope that's useful. The other cool thing is there's this Dirac cone in the background. This is actually a Dirac cone. It has the same Fermi velocity as the monolayer. And you can understand this quite simply. If you think of this top and bottom layer, if they're exactly aligned, then you can write it down in terms of an even and odd superposition of the 2 layers. The even superposition is going to see the middle layer, just like how bilayer graphene sees the middle layer. The odd superposition is going to see, from the top it's going to have a plus sign, and from the bottom it's going to have a minus sign, and so it's going to cancel out. And so this Dirac cone is basically a monolayer graphene Dirac cone that doesn't see the middle layer at all. So that's kind of a cool little side effect. One of the problems with this, at least when I talk to experimentalists, is that this picture is only nice if the layers are aligned. If the top and the bottom layer, the red and the blue, are not exactly aligned with each other, if there's a small shift between them, even if their angles are the same, you don't get nice band structure. Everything gets really messy because there's no symmetry. So we did some simulations of mechanical energy in this system, and we found that because of the mismatch between the layers, you're able to actually make an argument that the AA stacking is in equilibrium. So the thing you want, which is when the 2 layers are aligned, actually happens, even if you don't fabricate it in that way. So this energy scale here, this is different stackings between the top and the bottom layer, and this here is about 20 MeV per square nanometer. This energy scale is about the same as the total energy improvement you get from doing relaxation in twisted bilayer graphene. So this is quite a large number experimentally because we know bilayer graphene relaxes quite significantly. So we're hoping that this means that if people try to make this thing, they're not going to be tearing their hair out. And this is just a picture of the relaxation patterns. The color scale here is telling you the local curvature due to the relaxation. So because the systems are relaxing, they're kind of twisting around the AA spots and untwisting around the BA spots. They're twisting around AA and untwisting around BA and AB. So this is just showing that off. It's not super important to the argument, though. OK, and then in the last few minutes, I'm going to go over some studies where we did lithium. Oh, sorry.
One of the things for Corey Deeman talked about when you put down the twisted layers, and you let them sit at room temperature, they rotate.
Mm-hmm.
They have places they like to go.
Yeah.
Which is troublesome if you don't want them to go that way. But are there like magic angles where they like to sit that way that are
yeah.
not interesting?
Yeah, so I think they were mostly looking at the large twist angle case, so near 30 degrees. This is near the graphene quasicrystal.
Yeah.
What you'll find is that the commensurate stackings, the commensurate twist angles near 30 degrees have a much lower energy. And so when they do these friction studies at room temperature, they see these huge peaks in friction at like 21 degrees, and then the next one's like 14 degrees. These are the commensurate twist angles where it's actually a periodic structure. Yeah, this is focusing on low angle stuff. So I don't think at the small angle limit, the different twist angles don't really have that much energy variation between them. The important thing.
They still rotate.
Well, it wants to sit at, eventually it wants to sit at 0 degrees, right? Because that's going to be the lowest energy. It's Bernal stack graphene. So there's a huge goal to get there. So when you make these, you can't put them in the furnace or they'll turn all into Bernal stack graphene. So you have to keep it at room temperature or lower. Yeah.
So that equilibrium at AA stacking configurations.
Yeah.
So that's due to the interaction between middle layer and then top and bottom layer.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So does that also depend on the twisting angle?
I think it's a pretty global result as long as the twisting angle is small. Like, I mean, if the twisting angle in the middle layer is like 10 degrees, I don't think this happens. But if the angle is like 1.5 or 1 degree or 2 degrees, I think this always is the picture. Yeah.
Is that assuming that like the middle twisted layer does not move around?
So that's a really good question. It turns out, if you let the middle layer move around, like forwards and backwards in space, it doesn't change anything because all you're doing is you're just picking a different origin for your Moiré system. So the middle layer could move around all at once and then sit somewhere, and that doesn't affect any of the calculations because that just corresponds to putting the center of your Moiré system somewhere else. It's a translational symmetry of the system. Yeah, the reason we discovered this is because my collaborator Zoe was doing calculations for these different alignments without fixing the stacking distance. And we got exactly the same result no matter what we made this. So basically our model was always relaxing it to the high symmetry mode. You would look at the relaxation patterns and it would be these giant vectors across the whole thing because the whole thing was just sliding back to the origin. Okay, so I only have a few minutes, so I'm just going to go through this very quickly. This was some work that we did last year with a visitor, very good young scientist called Zheyu Liu. He's currently going to be at Berkeley as a grad student. What he looked at was the lithium intercalation in a twisted supercell of MOS2. So the takeaway is that lithium, when it's in between the layers, you can use chemical potentials to push lithium into the system, ionic lithium. It donates electrons to the system, and it changes the type binding coupling quite significantly. So over here is the coupling at large distances, and over here is the coupling when the lithium is nearby. So lithium affects the coupling. Okay, because of that, it affects the interlayer hybridization at the band edge. So this is the K-point conduction band edge of this MOS2 for different stackings, but with different amounts of lithium in between. So if you have no lithium, the band edge is basically they're either degenerate or there's a small hybridization. So there's a small splitting happening here. This splitting is the interlayer coupling between the layers. This is the Moiré potential. So here the Moiré potential is very weak. It's about 10 MeV. As you put more and more lithium in, you can make it either twice the size or 3 times the depth. You can make it twice the depth, 3 times the depth. And as we said earlier with pressure, if you make the Moiré potential deeper, you're able to get more flat bands. So this is just showing that off really quickly. As I go from the left to the right here, I'm adding more lithium to my model. These are 2 different twisting angles. And you can see that when the lithium is highly intercalated, so it's basically in the entire system, which is this labeling over here, things that were originally not flat become very flat. And things that were flat and then not flat are now very flat and much more flat, and these are actually separated. So you can see that you're really pushing the system. It's like pushing the system to the small angle limit, but without changing the length scale between the layers. And for studying superconductivity or correlations, this is going to be really important because the further away you make the things, even if they're really flat, if they're like really far away, the on-site Hubbard terms and the interlayer Hubbard terms are going to be very weak, and so you're not going to see interesting physics. Okay.
So for this to work, the lithium has to sit on specific sites, or do you use
Yeah, exactly. So the lithium, where it likes to sit, it wants to sit kind of aligned with the metal atoms. So the metal atoms are transition metals. The lithium donates electrons. So it wants to always be aligned with at least one metal atom. I think that's shown here. Yeah. So these are the low energies. We actually also did a study of the energetics of this, like where the lithium wants to sit as a function of the stacking. I definitely didn't have time to talk about that because it's quite complicated. What you find is that the lithium always wants to be aligned with as many metal atoms as possible. So this kind of tells you where it wants to sit in the superlattice.
So how much of the density of lithium you talking about here?
I think it's 1 lithium per every 4. For these pictures, it's 1 lithium for every 4 unit cells of the TMDC bilayer. So it's like 1 lithium for 8 copies of the monolayer cell, yeah, which is quite high. But the point is that these things, they want to sit at the area where the band is biggest, because remember, the d orbitals are what's causing the band splitting. And so the lithium wants to sit where the d orbitals are, so it's going to naturally enhance the interlayer coupling, even at much lower densities. Because I think the idea, we don't know if this is true, because they'll have to do the experiment and then see the thermodynamics of it, but the lithium is going to want to live at mm first. That's when the metals are aligned. So when you intercalate the system, most of the lithiums are going to be in this area. They're not going to be in these areas. So that should help a lot.
So when you say 1 lithium atom per 4 unit cell, is that for superlattice unit or original?
So this is for original unit. Yeah, that's what these pictures, if you look here, you can see this is the honeycomb aligned, the AA type aligned system. And you can see there's 1 lithium here, and then no lithium on the 3 next to it. So that's 1 per every 4. Yeah. Okay, and so I'm just going to quickly go through my acknowledgements. There was a number of topics that I brought up during this talk. For most of it, it was in very fruitful collaboration with members of Professor Kaksiri's group, as well as Professor Luskin's group at University of Minnesota. Those are the mathematical friends I referenced earlier. The intercalation project was done with Jaeyu Liu, who led it, and I worked on it with him and with Daniel Larson here at Harvard, Chen Yuan in Subir's group. Okay, so here are my conclusions and some nice pictures. So thank you so much for listening.
Very nice. More questions?
Okay, so